I'm Tim Van Epp. I'm the chair of the APA International Division, and we're sponsoring this session on the development and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals by UN and other organizations such as our own, APA, ISOCARP, which is a co-sponsor of this conference, ICOMOS, which deals with, how do you call the acronym? The International Council of Monuments
and Sites.
And Sites. And the Global Planners Network, and in particular US cities. Can I ask people to raise their hands? Are you OAPA members based here in Oregon? Okay, most of you. And some of you are ISOCARP members coming from overseas. Okay, yeah, good mix. I think it's like a 3-to-1 ratio at the conference overall, something like that. So we're going to look at the Sustainable Development Goals. If you don't mind, I'm going to use the acronym SDGs, so I'll slip up less often, and New Urban Agenda, which is Sustainable Development Goal number 11, and I'll call that NUA if you don't mind. And we're going to look at its application across different geographic levels and across different sectors. So I'm the moderator, and I will stand up last to give a talk. And then we have 3 other speakers. They're all fantastic. I've heard them speak before. You're not going to be disappointed. First off will be Shipra Narang Suri. She's the Vice President of ISOCARP for Technical Assistance and Projects, and she's also a coordinator for Urban Planning and Design Branch of UN Habitat. And she's going to talk about UN Habitat's role and initiatives regarding the Sustainable Development Goals. That was their responsibility. And I think she's going to end up talking a bit about how UN Habitat and other UN agencies are organized for the implementation. And then next up will be Greg Scruggs, here in the red shirt. He is a senior correspondent with Cityscope magazine, and he will be covering SDGs implementation in US cities, including a project where it's being piloted in New York City, Baltimore, and San Jose, California. And then Andrew Potts, who's a partner in Nixon Peabody, which is a law firm, is going to speak on behalf of ICOMOS, again, the Institute for Monuments and Sites. And he's going to talk about global efforts to leverage cultural heritage for resilience and how to localize and measure SDG number 11, which contains the New Urban Agenda and the 6 heritage-related NUA provisions. Then I'm going to get up again and talk about APA. What is it that APA is doing? What can you as APA planners do in terms of implementing the SDGs? So without further delay, Shipra.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Tim, for asking me to come and speak at this session. I must say here that I speak largely on behalf of UN Habitat, as in my capacity as coordinator of the Urban Planning and Design Branch of the agency based in Nairobi. Yes, I'm also Vice President of ISOCARP for a few more hours till we have our bureau meeting this evening, and then there's a turnover of the executive committee. So I'm stepping down after 6 years on the executive committee, which is quite enough, I think. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the implementation of the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda. You have been sort of a little bit overdosed on the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda since this started, which is good. I don't think we talk about it enough in professional gatherings. But just to say that, step back a little bit, and maybe Greg will pick up on some of this because he was covering a lot of these international processes. This is what cities, many cities of the world look like. Crowded, busy, unplanned, unsustainable, not resilient to disasters, not prepared for disasters, and with a lot of migrants, with a lot of inequality, with poor quality housing and infrastructure, etc. So when the discussion around the Sustainable Development Goals started, there was a very big push by the urban community to say that, look, we need to acknowledge that urban is not just context. Urban is a complex issue by itself. Urbanization is something that's not going to go away, and we need a goal that is one of the Sustainable Development Goals that focuses on urban areas per se. The other side said, no, urban is important, and we'll mainstream it through all the other Sustainable Development Goals. Both are important. But we did feel that mainstreaming it would, there's always a little bit of loss of focus when you mainstream something. It's great, but where is the concentrated attention on urban issues, urban challenges, urban priorities, and urban potential? Where is the attention to actually build up on all the potential for sustainable development, for inclusion, and for economic growth that urban areas offer? So we got the urban SDG, which is the SDG 11, or the urban goal, as it gets called in different fora. And every sustainable development goal has a set of targets associated with it. These were the targets of the urban SDG. So there are 7, I'm sorry, it's not very readable, sorry about that. So the SDG 11 is make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. It's got 7 targets dealing with these themes, and I'm sure everybody in this room will find themselves and their work in one of these little circles, whether you work on housing, whether you work on urban renewal, whether you work on public space, mobility, energy, transport, cultural heritage, and disaster, etc. So, and the little sort of ovals on the side are what we're called the means of implementation targets, which is you cannot get to all of that without addressing all of these. These are the processes you need to put in place in order to achieve those goals and those targets. So you have to have national and regional development planning, you've got to have integrated policy making, particularly for disaster risk, and you've got to have policies related to sustainable resilient buildings. We haven't had that kind of attention on urban issues, urban problems, urban priorities in the last 50 years. So this was a really big achievement. But then people said, well, now we've got the urban goal, now we've got SDG 11, we've got a focus, why do we need now something more? And this was the next level of debate. And we had Habitat 3 coming up, which was the third in a series of conferences that happen every 20 years. The first one happened in Vancouver, led to the establishment of the UN Center for Human Settlements, which is now UN Habitat. The second one happened in Istanbul in 1996 and led to something called the Habitat Agenda, which guided a lot of professionals over the last 20 years in their work globally. And then people said, no, do we really need a Habitat 3? Because now we have the SDG 11. And the point was that the SDG 11, just like every other sustainable development goal, was something that was highly compressed, and that was like a lowest common denominator. The stuff that you see there is stuff that everybody can identify with. But there's a lot of nuance, and there's a lot of detail, and there's a lot of complexity, and there's a lot of other issues that get lost in it. So we said, no, we need something that details them out a little bit more, and that's where we came to the New Urban Agenda. How many of you had actually heard about the New Urban Agenda before you walked into this conference? Okay, that's not bad. Okay, how many of you have actually gone through it, even if you just skimmed through it? Okay, I think it's important that we all go through it, because it has really, like I said with the SDG 11, you will find yourself in it. You will find your work in it, you will find your city in it, you will find your context in it. The New Urban Agenda is really a universal agenda. It is not only for the developed countries or the developing countries or countries and cities in crisis or those recovering from disaster. It is for really everybody who is interested in cities. I used to teach a class of urban designers, and the first day I walked in and I said, what do you want to do when you grow up? And they said, each one of them, 20 kids in my class, each one of them said, I want to set up my own architectural design firm. Great, it's wonderful. and what kind of buildings, and we talked a little bit about it, and I said, every single project that you do, just remember that you will be single-handedly responsible for climate change, whether to mitigate it or to exacerbate it or to and they're like, really? What's climate change got to do with me? And it was interesting. These were young kids. I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that it's right or wrong, but it tells you that not a lot of young people get out of planning school, get out of design school without having the larger perspective. And when I started introducing them to some of these, they said, oh yeah, well, we didn't think of it this way. And I think it's important that we start looking at the larger perspective, because our problems don't start and end at our buildings and our sites and our communities. The new urban agenda has some of these themes are absolutely central to it: housing, planning, land, issues of formality and informality, growing issues of safety and security in cities. And by that I just don't mean, terrorist attacks, but really just crime, traffic accidents, road accidents, risk from building collapses, risk from, natural and man-made disasters, so a lot of that. A very strong and welcome emphasis on issues of gender and concerns of young people and youth in cities. We pushed, and I was part of civil society then, from ISOCARP and from other sort of civil society formations. We pushed very hard that you have to mainstream and institutionalize participation and consultation in this agenda, because otherwise it becomes an optional extra, right? I mean, I think Oregon and Portland is a great example of how participation is institutionalized from a very early stage, from what I've understood. But it's not the scenario everywhere else in the world. Participation is an add-on. It's a box you tick in many places. And we wanted that, in the implementation of the new urban agenda, the agenda itself should be an exemplar of how, participation can be institutionalized. Only then we can preach, to the world that you should do participatory planning. And of course, you heard Rick yesterday, and you've heard some of us say this before. There are lots of substantive references to planning in the new urban agenda. Planning is really back in vogue. Planning is at the center stage of the international development discussion, particularly the sustainable urban development discussion. It did not happen by accident. It happened because of a trajectory we've adopted over the last 10 years, particularly the World Urban Forum in Vancouver, where the Global Planners Network was formed, very much with the APA's involvement in the Canadian Institute of Planners and ISOCARP and several others, and a conscious push to bring back the discussion to planning, and planning as an instrument to bring divergent views together, to reconcile differences, to look at a future visioning without, and to break away from the old mold of planning, which was, sort of very stereotyped into a long drawn process, outdated, slow, an obstacle to development, etc. So that has really culminated in this place now that the new urban agenda has a very central focus on planning. And this is really, if you have a chance to look at it, right from the beginning where you talk about the transformative commitments for sustainable urbanization, all the way to the end where you talk about the implementation, references to planning are sort of woven through the text. And there is a section with 30 paragraphs that focuses only on urban planning and management. This is, especially for those of us who work in this realm, this is a big deal. I want to move on now, just as an example really, to talk about what UN Habitat is doing for the implementation of the new urban agenda. And this is not an advertisement, but this is just to provoke some interest and some thinking around what you can do as people, as professionals, as organizations, as advocates, as teachers, as researchers, for the implementation of the new urban agenda. UN Habitat has defined what it calls an action framework for the implementation of the new urban agenda. So just to add to the alphabet soup, it's AFINWA, one more acronym, which is pretty difficult to make sense of, I must say. And it's underpinned by three core principles, inclusion, innovation, and integration. I think you can find some of them here, particularly in Portland and in Oregon, but in many parts of the world you can. And it has 5 core categories. And the reason why we have these 5 categories is not just to rehash the New Urban Agenda, but to say that, look, we can't do everything. None of us in this room can claim to do everything or have the capacity to do everything that's listed in the New Urban Agenda. So let's identify our entry points. Let's identify our priorities. Even though UN Habitat is responsible for the overall coordination and leading the implementation, but still, I think we're conscious of our capacities and we're saying we need to start with some finite set of areas that we need to work on rather than this infinite universe of sustainable urban development. And these are the 5 categories of actions or priority areas that we've identified. Starting from sort of more a framing approach on the national urban policies. We talked about it in one of the sessions yesterday. 100-odd countries have initiated the process of preparing national urban policies, or in some cases, you look at the United States as a federal system, or India, or other parts as provincial urban policies, state-level urban policies. This is important because it sets the overall spatial framework. It sets, it lays out the jurisdictional issues. It proposes a pattern of settlements, etc. Then we talked about 3 pillars, what we call 3-legged approach: planning and design, legislation, and finance. But you cannot have urban development without all 3. You cannot have one or the other. It's not a choice. And finally, looking at local implementation. And this is roughly what, you have a copy of this presentation. I don't want to go through it, but this is roughly the kinds of issues that each of these categories deals with. So this is our thinking around the implementation process of the New Urban Agenda. And we believe that it needs to be accompanied by a whole lot of capacity building, a whole lot of orientation, lots of indicators, guidelines, tools, examples of good practice. These are not things that just come to us. You put them down on a piece of paper and you start implementing them tomorrow. It doesn't happen like that. There's a whole lot of other stuff that needs to accompany it to make it a reality. Let me finally come to what we see as the role of urban professionals in this process, and not just urban planners. Certainly there's a much larger community out there: the sociologists, the economists, the surveyors, the planners, the engineers, the municipal engineers, the architects, urban designers. There's a whole community of urban professionals that we want to work with. Apart from doing what you do in your day job, whatever you do, I think it's important that we see ourselves as advocates, that we see ourselves as people who hold our governments to account on some of these issues. Well, you went there, you signed up to these goals, you co-created these documents. It's not that the US government or the Indian government or the Chinese government was not involved in, so you can't come back home and disown them and say, oh, really? We don't do SDGs, or we don't do, climate change. Paris Agreement, or we don't do the Sendai framework for disasters. No, we do. We were part of co-creating these frameworks. So I think it's important that as professionals who work in this realm, who work in public interest, we hold our governments to account over what they've committed to in Quito and in the SDGs. At the same time, I think whether we work in the public sector or we work in the private sector, I think it's obligatory for us to support our local authorities in whatever way we can, through research, through projects, through various kinds of actions. I think it's also incumbent upon us to demand reform as an active civil society, and then to support reform. And very often we demand it, but when we see it, we don't like it, and then we back off. So I think that's a problem that a number of governments face as well. And of course, building up and sharing knowledge. What we do is really not restricted to a small realm. It will be interesting for other people to know how you're solving your problems, whether you're in Portland or in Seattle or in Washington or New York or in Delhi or in Mumbai. There may be diverse settings, but I think the lessons would be very, very important to share, and the knowledge would be important to share. And I think anything that we do in terms of innovative approaches, I think we need to encourage more innovation, and we need to encourage more scaling up of innovation. We need to support scaling up of innovation. We don't do that enough. Very often a pilot remains a pilot for 20 years, a pilot project, and then what's the point, if it's just doing the same little thing. And I think we need to do a lot more on data. You heard Cynthia say that yesterday. That was one of the points I took away from her speech. We need to do a lot more on monitoring, on data collection, because cities don't have enough data, national governments don't have the right kind of data they need for the right kind of policy making. And I think planners have a crucial role, urban professionals generally, but planners particularly have a crucial role there. And I think we, as I said, we need to continue to be champions and advocates of a larger international agenda, because we live in an increasingly interconnected and complex and difficult world. Thank you.
Good morning. So I'm Gregory. I am a planner and journalist. Planning background, American Institute of Certified Planners, but working in the media to write about planning issues with Cityscope, which is a nonprofit media outlet covering global trends in cities. And we have been focusing quite a bit on the implications of the United Nations suite of global agreements like the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. What do they mean for cities? So we have been following from a journalistic perspective, and that's the one that I'll be presenting today, not one where I've necessarily been working on behalf of any of the cities I'll be speaking about, but rather observing and reporting on and trying to understand how they are making this giant global agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 very lofty objectives to see a future where we have no poverty, where we have climate change nipped in the bud, where there's no hunger, these really ambitious goals. How do we make them relevant for cities, for a place like Portland, for example, where we're standing right now? And more to the point, at an interesting time in U.S. politics where there is increasing resistance, if not hostility, to this kinds of international ambitions. So I want to start off with a national index here, which is a project by the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN. If there's one four-letter acronym you take home today, if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend SDSN. They were mandated by the United Nations to serve as a technical expert group on all things sustainable development. And they are based in New York, housed at Columbia University. So while they have a global purview, they are particularly interested in supporting a domestic implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And they undertook a rather interesting exercise where they took all 17 goals and, using best available data sources for metropolitan statistical areas, MSAs, which is how we break things down at the subnational level in the US Census, national data collection in the US, and they marked everybody with a score from 0 to 100 as a percentage of how close are you to achieving on all of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now these are color-coded, so I realize it doesn't give you the exact numbers. I have some bad news for the Portlanders in the room. You are not number 1, or number 2, or number 3, which is actually where I live, up in Seattle, Bellevue, Tacoma MSA. You came in at number 10. Not bad, better than a lot of places in the country. Number 1, by the way, was the San Jose, Sunnyvale, Santa Clara MSA in California, and number 2 was Provo-Orem, Utah. So I'm not going to go through the entirety of their statistical measurements, but I certainly encourage you to take a look at this. One place, and this is a summary of the main findings. So you'll just see the highest are the ones that I mentioned, the lowest are some of our Rust Belt places like Cleveland and Detroit, as well as Baton Rouge in the Deep South. Looking at some of the poverty and health statistics that came up as part of their measurement. But I wanted to compare 2 in particular. On the left is no poverty, so that's goal number 1. Quite easy to measure the percentage of your population that is in what we would define as the poverty line. And in that one, did Portland even make the top 10? I don't think it did, but you'll notice what I wanted to show is that you see a number of affluent cities, right? You've got your Bostons, your Silicon Valleys, your Seattles, Washington, D.C. Denver, places with really booming economies right now, what Richard Florida likes to call the superstar cities. So they're performing very well by that metric. Look at the right-hand column, number 11, goal 11, the fabled urban SDG, the one that most planners who are interested in the Sustainable Development Goals latch onto. It's sort of, this is our home, this is where we want to make something count with this United Nations global agenda. I find this to be a very interesting set of rankings and not the ones I would have guessed. We're looking at, for those who aren't familiar with the United States geography, we're looking at some of the cities and metropolitan areas that are not known for booming economies, that are not known for sustainable transportation investments, that are not known for having a MAX-style light rail system allowing you to get around McAllen, Edinburgh, Mission, Texas. So why? Why did some of the cities that we would not, if I had done a poll in the room, what are our top sustainable cities in the US, why did those end up at the top of the ranking? And from peeling back the hood a little bit on their analysis, the number one issue was housing affordability. So they were using a statistic on how many families are rent burdened and how many homeowners are house burdened. And I believe that's what tipped this measurement so far in favor of cities that we wouldn't traditionally think of in the US as quote-unquote sustainable and would promptly wipe the Portland, Seattle's, Boston, Silicon Valley's off the map, at least when it comes to goal 11. Now, when you're weighing all 17 goals, that's where you end up with Silicon Valley, San Jose at number 1. But looking at it at this level, for me in particular, was a very eye-opening exercise in terms of what do we mean when we say sustainability? And when we're trying to measure that at a statistical level, we might find some surprising results. So SDSN, the 4-letter acronym that I highly recommend taking home, has been working with 3 cities in the US on piloting local implementation of the SDGs. And how do you take this large global agreement negotiated by diplomats, most of whom have very little knowledge about how city and metropolitan governments and economies work, how do you make them relevant? So SDSN is working with New York City, Baltimore, and San Jose on a sort of a pilot to, in various guises, make this thing, this vast apparatus called the SDGs useful. So I'm going to quickly gloss over those 3 examples as possible angles that especially if you're, say, here in Portland, you wanted to see your city latch on to the SDGs, you might draw some inspiration from. I think the most broad brush or sort of overall architecture would be in New York. So the New York City Sustainability Plan is, and many cities, I suspect Portland, have sustainability plans that have been prepared by planning offices and adopted by council. It's called One NYC. And One NYC has essentially retrofitted itself onto the SDG agenda. And they describe themselves as a city with global goals, and the global goals is a sort of another term or a rebranding of SDGs. And in One NYC, the different sustainable development goals have been mapped onto the sustainability goals for the city. So it was a bit of a, well, we already have an existing template that's similar to what the SDGs are all about. Why don't we just kind of try to line up the categories? And I think with, my impression is without too much extra lifting, New York City was able to turn around and say, we are working toward the SDGs at a city level. I think the most interesting example is from Baltimore. So this mural is of a young man named Freddie Gray. And 2 years ago, he was arrested by the Baltimore police, thrown in the back of a paddy wagon, and by the time they got to the station, he had broken his spine, fallen into a coma, and eventually died. That incident sparked the worst riots that Baltimore has faced since the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, and led to some serious reckoning in Baltimore about deep divisions, mostly around race, mostly between black and white, and the disproportionate amount of police violence experienced by black Baltimoreans. So in Baltimore, a group at the University of Baltimore that runs a neighborhood indicators project where they try to create statistical measurements for individual neighborhoods, looked at the SDGs, zeroed in on goal 16, access to justice. That's a squishy category. That's a difficult thing to provide a statistical, quantifiable measurement on. And they wrestled with this. They worked with different advocates in Baltimore, community groups that are pushing for reforms to this criminal justice system. And they settled on the amount of time spent in pre-trial detention. That is to say, the time from when you have been arrested and charged with a crime until the time when you face a judge or jury and are tried under the due process judicial system of the United States. If you are poor, if you do not have the money to post bond or bail, you sit in jail, technically still innocent. You are innocent until proven guilty, but you still sit in jail. It's called pre-trial detention. And those numbers can get quite high, weeks, months at a time, that an innocent person is nevertheless held in detention. So they settle on that as an indicator that we as a city of Baltimore can try to reduce if we want to meet the global standard of the Sustainable Development Goals. And they found it to be a useful rubric to initiate a community-wide conversation about, how do you measure access to justice post Freddie Gray. Finally, the number one winner in the SDG index prepared by SDSN, as I mentioned, was San Jose, the central city in the booming economic region known as Silicon Valley. And in this case, you're looking at a community that's access to a lot of tech talent. Stanford University, which is the arguably leading institution of higher education for the burgeoning, or forget burgeoning, now sort of leading aspect of the West Coast economy, the tech sector. You have a lot of smart folks that know how to crunch numbers. And in the case of San Jose, their answer to how do we make the SDGs relevant was to create a dashboard and working at a neighborhood level to actually go to census tracts, individual, the smallest unit of measurement under the US Census, to take different measurements like your miles traveled for your commute, which would be fit in under SDG 11, the Sustainable Cities Goal, and start to get that data at a really minute level so that individual residents in San Jose could assess how their neighborhood, even how their block or a really small geographic unit of measurement is doing. And apparently, as a whole, San Jose is doing quite well. But nevertheless, when you drill down within a metropolitan area, you can see where there are discrepancies, where somebody's doing better, where somebody's not doing so well, and that allows for more targeted advocacy efforts. If there's a particular area that has really a lot of folks commuting by car, you can see that at this more granular level and maybe focus some of your planning and advocacy efforts around that. So stepping back to a national perspective, having looked at those three cities, the Urban Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C., has also been trying to wrestle with the relevance, statistically speaking, of the SDGs for the United States context. And in a report that they released in just last month called Hacking the Sustainable Development Goals, they actually looked at how we collect data in the United States and compared that to the indicators that have been formally adopted by something called the United Nations Statistical Commission. So we had the 17 goals and then the 169 targets. And for the last 2 years or so, a group of statisticians from around the world have been debating back and forth and still haven't quite reached resolution on some of them. What indicators at a global scale are we going to use so that every country can compare apples to apples their progress toward the SDGs? Now, as you can imagine, when you have to find a statistical measure that both the US and South Sudan and the People's Republic of China and Israel can all commonly agree on that they all collect, it might not be the most relevant for an individual city like a Portland. And so what this analysis discovered is that the SDGs have four goals that have targets that are really well suited to how we collect data in US cities. They found that the indicators that have been agreed upon, the ones I just described, only 19% of them can actually be collected in the US with our existing data collection system in the US Census. And NSO there stands for National Statistical Office, which again in our case would be the US Census. And then finally, for 5 of the goals, none of those UN indicators could actually be measured here in the United States. So when they describe hacking the SDGs, they at the Urban Institute really think that we as a country should be modifying and coming up with our own set of indicators that work for US cities. I mean, a good example they gave was for air quality, which is one of the, I believe that's in goal 11, one of the indicators, just sort of, I think it's, particulate matter based on some global World Health Organization standard. It's just a national data point. So having a single statistical measurement for the United States that says our average air particulate matter is X tells you absolutely nothing about the difference between smoggy Los Angeles, which according to research I looked into this, has the worst average particulate matter, and the clean air in the Burlington, Vermont metropolitan statistical area. So we really need to look at these things at a more granular level for them to have any relevance for us here in the States. Finally, I want to conclude on a cautionary, if not somewhat somber note. This is a story published in a similar publication called Next City, which does arguably the best reporting on cities specifically in the United States. And it's about the right-wing fear-mongering campaign around Agenda 21, which was a UN kind of precursor to the SDGs that's now 25 years old. And once upon a time, this kind of, basically, to sum it up, according to right-wing conspiracy theorists, the United Nations is a world government that is trying to take over private property rights, force everybody off of their homes into Soviet-style collective communities, blah, 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 blah. Now, this is all easy to snicker at, except that this is precisely the kind of rhetoric that's currently informing the President of the United States of America. And so what was once right-wing conspiracy theories are now have direct pipeline to the U.S. federal government. And so we've already seen the U.S. set its intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, to withdraw from UNESCO. I have yet to see any specific pronouncements on the Sustainable Development Goals, which, as an agreement, is technically the Agenda 2030. So I've yet to see, and that word agenda is one that sets off this particular segment of the American population. I've yet to see any specific indicators or suggestions that the U.S. is going to pull out of the SDGs. But when it comes to this global voluntary agreement, I think that cities will have to work hard to pick up the slack because our national government is very likely to just drop the ball. If anything, not bother answering the annual surveys of how are you doing, what kind of progress are you making. And that makes the work that individual cities are doing all the more important if we care about this kind of global agreement. Thank you.
Hello. As Tim said, my name is Andrew Potts. I'm here on behalf of ICOMOS, which is the International Council on Monuments and Sites. ICOMOS is an international NGO that works on cultural heritage issues. We work through 130 some national committees. So for example, for the Americans in the room, there's a thing called US ICOMOS, which is the US National Committee of ICOMOS. And so it's quite possible that your city historic preservation officer, your state SHPO, state historic preservation officer, local and statewide historic preservation officials are members of US ICOMOS, and US ICOMOS is a member of the international organization headquartered in Paris, and that's how we in the cultural heritage sector collaborate globally. Want to talk about cultural heritage in the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda, and because I'm from the cultural heritage sector, I want you to think about this topic in particular, but you could also think about this more generally as just an illustration of the way any given theme is playing out in the context of the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda. Shipra mentioned that SDG Goal 11, the urban goal, has 7 targets. There's a target on public space, there's a target on affordable housing, and there's a target on cultural heritage. So this is from the microcosm, the perspective of one of those 7 targets. There are similar processes and discussions and issues unfolding regarding the others. The target in the SDGs on cultural heritage specifically says, in order to make cities and human settlements sustainable, resilient, safe, and inclusive, strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. Interesting to note that it tethers natural and cultural heritage, which in the US we might call a landscape approach, one that tethers cultural and natural heritage together. For starters, it may surprise you that when the UN General Assembly selected the top of the fold 7 categories of endeavor that were most relevant to urban resilience and sustainability, one of the 7 is cultural heritage, cultural and natural heritage, up there with affordable housing, infrastructure, public space. I'm gonna, in the course of my presentation, try to give you some insights into why that is, but I'll just say at the outset that in a lot of places in the world, and particularly a lot of places in the United States, the cultural heritage officials, in the United States we call them historic preservation officials, aren't living up to the potential of heritage embedded in the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda. So at the end I'll come back to that idea of what will it take to really unlock this potential. As has already been said, after the SDGs were adopted, came along the New Urban Agenda, and in some important ways the New Urban Agenda kind of unpacks and builds out on the SDGs, including SDG Goal 11. Cultural heritage is sort of a cross-cutting theme, so it appears in the New Urban Agenda in a bunch of different places, but you can sort of lump it together, you can aggregate it into about 5 themes. And so to my way of thinking, you take the one sentence in the SDGs on cultural heritage, SDG 11.4, which says urban resilience, safety, inclusiveness, and sustainability can come from more cultural and natural heritage safeguarding. You build that out and you get about 5 modalities, five ways that plays out. Spatial planning, employment, quality, decent jobs, inclusive economic growth, social cohesion, social participation, and environmental resilience. So what I want to do now is just walk through a couple examples of the way communities around the world, some in the US, some elsewhere, are localizing, to use some UN speak, are trying to realize the potential expected of cultural heritage in the New Urban Agenda and the SDGs in their community. I'll start with spatial planning. I figured that would be the home issue for many of you in the room. What the New Urban Agenda says, it's in section 124, is that culture should be a priority component of urban plans, should be embedded into zoning guidelines, building codes, coastal management policies, strategic development policies. It also says that the goal of planning should be to promote urban infill and prioritize revitalization of existing urban areas while protecting cultural heritage and preventing sprawl. That's New Urban Agenda 97, section 97. So in the US and in a lot of places, particularly in the West, this, if anything, is the focus of efforts to leverage cultural heritage, historic preservation for sustainability, this idea of reusing buildings. And so this, if in any of these 5 categories, Americans, say for example, were to get a high grade, it would be at this one, I would think. But even in this category, there remains a tremendous opportunity to better realize the potential of historic buildings and cultural heritage in spatial planning. And I want to just give an example from the US on this. And it's a project called the Atlas of Re-Urbanism. It's a project of the US National Trust for Historic Preservation, their Green Lab. What it starts with is the premise that you need to know where your good stock of older and historic buildings are to know how to leverage them. And second, that the existing systems that we have in this country and in most countries for inventorying landmarks and listing historic buildings is not a good proxy for the stock of older and historic buildings that we have, which can be drivers of sustainability and economic activity in communities. Moreover, those records tend to be the last to be digitized, the last to be incorporated into data sets, the last to be mapped spatially. In a sense, historic preservation is really too important to be left to historic preservationists, because we get this result that city historic preservation offices have enormous amounts of data about the buildings and the heritage in their community, none of which is plugged into broader data sets and big data. So the Atlas of Re-Urbanism has a thing called a character score, which takes aspects of the built environment that have been demonstrated scientifically to promote creativity, engender walkability, create social cohesion. They overlay it with information about the age of buildings, and they create hotspots, which are places where there are concentrations of high value, high social value older buildings that then can guide spatial planning, called the Atlas of Re-Urbanism. And I wanted to give this example because it brings in a so-called means of implementation, a strategy for actually realizing the goals of the New Urban Agenda that I think is important, which is tapping into big data. It was mentioned already. So that's just a teaser on spatial planning. I'll move to the second way that cultural heritage figures prominently in the New Urban Agenda, and that's as a tool of inclusive economic growth. So, in the United States, we have this mad dash to host Amazon's HQ2, and this is indicative of a strategy for economic development, which is landing out-of-town companies. It's a big one. We have another strategy that's common, which is tech transfer, where you try to capitalize on new technology, for example. What this New Urban Agenda asks is for you to focus on endogenous potentials. It's kind of a fancy word. What are you good at locally already? What do people already know how to do where you live? What are your local strengths? What have you been doing for 100 or 1,000 years that could be capitalized upon for new economic development? I'll give you an example that I was personally involved in. This is in the Chia region of Colombia. So these women, they're indigenous peoples and marginalized to some extent, have been weaving sisal, grass, into bags for coffee bags for hundreds of years. And now what they're doing is taking that local tradition and that local knowledge and making these things, which among other things are wall coverings that you find on fancy restaurants and hotels all around the world. So, this is kind of a heartwarming example. You may have read about examples like this in other places. But what's interesting to me is the question of how did this happen? Who in Chia was mapping the social values of the community, figuring out what people in Chia are already good about, and then marrying that information with people who knew about import, export, and product development? Who's doing that in your town? So is your Historic Preservation Office doing that? Are they aware of the intangible values of the community that have this endogenous potential, to use all these fancy buzzwords? I think it's points to a huge area of opportunity and a huge area of need in terms of realizing the potential of heritage in the New Urban Agenda. The next thing the New Urban Agenda spends a lot of time focusing on is employment and how culture and heritage are drivers of decent jobs through creativity, cultural industries, tourism. There's a controversial word, tourism, which I'm actually not going to talk about too much, but it peeks into my presentation at this point, and fine arts. You see pictures here of two examples of a project in Delhi, India, the Nizamuddin initiative, which is of the Aga Khan Development Network, which is a fantastic project. The two best heritage-based community revitalization strategies I've seen in the world, one is this one in Delhi, and the other is, I would say, in Cincinnati, Center City Cincinnati Development Corporation Initiative in the Over the Rhine neighborhood. So I encourage you to Google both of them. These people are leveraging traditional crafts and trades for economic development. And this is kind of what we think about, right? This and tourism when we think about cultural heritage and jobs, good jobs. But the example I want to share with you is from Scotland, from Dundee. This is part of the European Commission's Culture for Cities initiative, which is looking at how to leverage culture and heritage for new creative industries. So Dundee has a long industrial tradition, a long design tradition, and so what are the aspects of Dundee's tradition of industrial design that are relevant to the 21st century? And it plays out in gaming, iPhone apps, computer development, and also traditional fine arts. So this Dundee strategy, which just got a big award from the European Commission, I think is an important example of the way creativity, heritage, they say, is the crucible of creativity. It's the accumulated intellectual capital of a community leveraged for economic development. If you're a spatial planner, you might be saying, oh, well, that all sounds good. Somebody should do that. Maybe the Arts Commission in my town should do that. What does this have to do with me? I just want to draw your attention to this study on the left called Older, Smaller, Better, funded by the U.S. Department of Energy. And the DOE-funded study found that older historic neighborhoods, this is United States focused, their spatial qualities, the morphology of the buildings, the mixture of public and private spaces, incubate 21st century creative industries better than any other type of physical layout. They found absolute direct correlations between traditional neighborhood settlement patterns and 21st century creative jobs. So I want to just mention that spatial planning dimension. The second to last way that cultural heritage figures prominently in the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda is this idea of social cohesion, How do you knit together disparate elements of your community? How do you break down inequality? How do you get the people to function together cohesively? And with migration, climate refugees, the stresses put on communities by climate change, a host of issues. There's questions of how do you hold the people together as a polity, and how do you integrate newcomers and longtime residents and the like is quite important. I could have picked a lot of examples, but I wanted to pick one from the US because I think sometimes people kind of Americans outsource this as kind of an issue for foreign countries. And I also wanted to give you an example that has a spatial planning dimension. So at the bottom, this is San Antonio, Texas. At the bottom left, you see downtown San Antonio. Could be a lot of North American cities. At the top, you see the San Antonio missions, which are sort of the beating heart of San Antonio. These iconic missions set up by the Spanish colonial officials in the 17th century. So important, they were recently inscribed on the World Heritage List. Only 23 sites in the US are on the World Heritage List, and this is the latest US inscription. You might think that they were inscribed on the World Heritage List because of their architecture, or maybe because one of the 7 is the Alamo, and the Battle of the Alamo was consequential in global history. Those were all proposed, and they were rejected by the World Heritage Committee as bases for inscription. The thing that the World Heritage Committee found to be of outstanding universal value with this mission are the intangible qualities that arose when Spanish and indigenous cultures mixed and created one of the birthplaces of Latino culture. So San Antonio, this mission phenomenon in the 17th century, the mixing of indigenous and Western peoples is a driver of creation of Latino culture. And so the values that are important about the San Antonio missions are what the World Heritage Inscription calls the creative energy from the confluence of cultures. So, fine. These get inscribed, a $100 million tourism boon to San Antonio because of the World Heritage Inscription, and a requirement imposed by the inscription that there be zoning overlays that conserve the heritage values. This is a condition of getting inscribed. You have to agree to especially protect the special things you have. So San Antonio's zoning overlay and their building code processes all focus on the built environment, design review. But the key values of this inscription are tethered to the built environment, but ultimately are not the built environment. They're the intangible values that come from this creative mixing of cultures. And so how do you start to take account of these incredibly so valuable cultural traditions that they are on the World Heritage List as such and are driving $100 million of new tourism in design review, permitting, zoning overlay? So the mayor of San Antonio convened this thing called Living Heritage Symposium, which asked stakeholders to begin to think about how to incorporate a recognition and a conservation of these intangible values, these social traditions, into design, permitting, and building review. And you see here lots of people busy at a charrette scribbling on pieces of paper to do that. So I think it gives you a sense of how this sense that I think probably all have, that culture and heritage can bring people together. How does it now play out on the landscape? Okay, and finally, what I'll call ecological or environmental resilience. This is chalked throughout the New Urban Agenda, asking people to try to break down their silos between regulating nature and culture, to look at the interdependence of ecological and social functions of the land, ecosystem-based solutions that recognize that people are in the ecosystem, looking at consumption and production patterns, and the role of culture in resiliency and climate change adaptation. There's a lot that could be said about this. I want to just show you these 2 examples. They have nothing to do, the ones on the left have nothing to do on the right. The ones on the left are also from Delhi. This is the oldest stepwell. There's a lot of notoriety about these India stepwells. This is the only functioning one left in Delhi. It was built in the 14th century. It was not repaired meaningfully for 700 years. So 700 years later, a zero carbon infrastructure solution that was still basically working. According to the city of Delhi, the water quality was as good as it's around elsewhere. It then did get a major cleaning. That's what you see here, the only one in 700 years. But so the question is, how do you valorize traditional technology, traditional infrastructure, traditional knowledge in contemporary planning? Do you automatically assume that everything that's old is bad, needs to be replaced, that there's nothing we can learn from 1,000 years of living successfully in the spots where we live? Or can you mainstream traditional technology and traditional knowledge into contemporary planning? On the right, my final example, this is from the United States. This is New Orleans. This is south of New Orleans. This is the Ile Jean-Charles. It's the first city in the United States to be moved in whole, planned relocation because of climate change. So sea level rise, making this place untenable, unfit for human habitation. There are now 11 cities, towns in the US on a list to be relocated. There will be hundreds. According to the UNFCCC, 300 million people will have to be moved in the next 30 years because they live in places that are untenable for human settlement. They will become untenable for human settlement. Right now in the United States, this is treated as a refugee problem. You and your family need to go somewhere else. But that diaspora scatters the community, it destroys the cultural capital of the community, it obliterates their intangible heritage and their traditions. This is a HUD demonstration project to move the town in total to another place. It's the first one in the United States, hopefully a prototype. And what we see rife throughout this is the way that once you actually start to move people, culture and heritage becomes a gigantic driver of the success or failure of these projects. And we know this from mega dam projects also, but the advent of climate change, making planned relocation a gigantic planning problem, and the role of culture existential to the successful moving of people. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there, try to give you a flavor of the way that cultural heritage, one of the transversal issues that's in the SDGs, is playing out, its potential, its opportunities. I just leave you with a question, and that is, how many of these axes of heritage, how many of these nodes of value are being realized in your own community? How many of you have state historic preservation officers or HPOs that are focusing on these aspects of your community's heritage? Greg mentioned the One New York initiative to map New York City's comprehensive plan against the SDGs. Greg, I don't know if you looked at it. It says 11.4, it says NA. and I like SDSN, but that's par for the course in my experience with them.
Observer and not speaking on behalf of.
So I hope you will not come from a community where this gigantic swath of the new urban agenda gets an NA, and I thank you for your time.
Well, thank you to all three of you. Excellent presentations. So, as chair of the APA International Division, I think of my role as explaining to you what APA is doing and what our division is doing relative to the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda, and to use that background to encourage you and your organizations to also think about how you might relate to the SDGs, what you might be doing, what you could do in terms of pilot projects or research or education to further the SDGs, which, as I think our speakers have demonstrated, are applicable to U.S. cities in a voluntary way. There's no rule saying you have to, but I think getting onto the international bandwagon with SDGs and the NUA is a really positive thing to do for planners. So in this presentation, which I'll try to shorten somewhat because we're just a little bit behind, I'm going to try and do three things. One is, as I'm suggesting, review what APA is doing, has done so far and is continuing to do. And then second and third parts are about research projects which APA, and in particular the Division's Council and our division, are sponsoring or could be sponsoring. One is about planning for livable communities for all ages, and the other one is about regional planning and how that might relate to the SDGs. So the Quito Ecuador conference, Habitat 3, in October 2016, APA was very involved in leading up to that, planning for it, as well as participating in it. We spent APA money to send 4 of us there as the official delegation. I was one of those people, as well as our executive director, the president of the membership, and our full-time staff international director. But there were a lot of other APA members that I met while I was there. We participated in various sessions, gave talks, and we had a booth, very large booth that we shared with the Global Planners Network, which is a loose assemblage of 30 or more planning associations from other countries, as well as with our allied planning design organizations like the American Institute of Architects. And wow, sorry. It's my doctor. Hopefully nothing serious. So we had a booth with them and with ASLA and AIA. Then, in terms of the preparation for that, it's been a very collaborative process. We have been through mainly Jeff Soul, our international director, who could not make it today. I'm actually substituting for him. He was involved in the World Urban Campaign, the Global Assembly of Partners, Habitat Professionals Forum. I don't want to get into a lot of definitions, but these are all different kind of components or elements of the overall SDG development process, the NU8 process. And we used our APA policy guides as one basis for our input. One of the main outputs of that was the city we need, which fed into the new urban agenda. So the kinds of things that we're doing fall into just a few categories: public awareness, information to our members. Please see the webpage. Jeff Soul does what he calls a blog that keeps you up to date on Habitat 3 related issues and topics. It's actually an excellent place to go for information. Education through conferences and webinars like this conference, upcoming the World Town Planning Day, which is an online conference on November 8th, Wednesday. There'll be 6 or 7 sessions. They'll be pre-recorded this year. You'll see this session, which is being pre-recorded now, on that day. And then the research projects, which I already mentioned. So part 2 of the presentation on living communities for all ages. There's been like a Divisions Council initiative that's a few years old, where we looked at this topic from a US-centric basis. And now the international components of APA and AARP are collaborating with another partner, OVA Arab is one of our division partners. We're all providing in-kind support plus staff support from our our respective organizations. And we have a $7,000 research grant from the Divisions Council. It's not a lot of money, but it's a start. And the project is basically kind of an initial phase, which will report out at the National Planning Conference in New Orleans in April 2018. But we hope that it will lead to further phases. But the basis for the international look at this topic is that our counterparts in Europe and East Asia are actually ahead of us on the age curve. So by 2030 here in the US, over 20% of our population will be 65 or older. And most of those people would prefer to age remain in their communities. You hear a lot about retiring to Florida. It's not happening to the extent you might hear people talking about it. We all end up ultimately making more conservative decisions about where we're going to live. And while we talk about aging as perhaps a principal focus of this research, on the other hand, if you are accommodating people in their retiring people in their existing communities. It's good for children and for young families as well. So you get into the related topic of multi-generational planning. So we're thinking, although the Europeans are ahead of us and they have perhaps more immediate lessons and case studies and best practices to share with us, ultimately this is a topic that we assume or we hope will be a two-way street in terms of the flow of best practices and so forth. But how is it related to the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, goal number 11, which is encapsulating the New Urban Agenda, makes explicit reference to accommodating older persons in sustainable transport systems and sustainable green public spaces. The New Urban Agenda itself recognizes the importance of planning for all ages with 27 different references to age-friendly planning. So the idea of the project is to firstly find out what are the best practices for engaging planners to think about this in a mainstreamed kind of way in their everyday planning, not as something that they'll look at some research document somewhere or they'll do on a one-off basis, but to mainstream this into local planning. And then beyond that, as I mentioned, to find best practices, lessons learned, case studies from overseas. And that's how we've actually structured the project. Jumping ahead a little bit, as I promised. So on World Town Planning Day, the first session that morning, which is timed so that Europeans can view it as well, we'll have a pre-recorded session on this topic. And it'll end with an invitation to go to a questionnaire to fill out on engagement, the engagement process. And at the end of that questionnaire, you'd be invited to go to another questionnaire or a template to fill out if you have access to best practices that you're willing to share. And then we'll, over the coming months, crunch all that data. We believe we'll have another webinar sometime in February to sort of begin to report out and to fine-tune our results. And then during the national conference in New Orleans, we'll give a report on this initial phase and make recommendations for follow-up phases. And in the meantime, there are, as you may be aware, some new efforts by APA to create community portals for sharing information, tools and things like that, techniques, methodologies, and a resource knowledge base, which ultimately planners, not just the staff, will be able to put up like best practices, case studies. It'll be hopefully an interactive kind of resource for our results. If you want more information, you can email me. My email's there, or Stephanie Firestone, who's the AARP project manager. And a lot of this information, these slides, by the way, I'm going to make available at the International Division's webpage on the APA website for this whole session. So you can get a lot of this information that way. Just very quickly, the other project, and there's some useful websites here, is about regional planning, which I know in Portland, regional planning is important. You guys are a model, pioneer in regional planning in the U.S. I'm a regional planner by background, by training, and I did a sort of a thorough review, I think a thorough review of the SDGs and the NUA. And I think that regional planning isn't too emphasized. It's not a big surprise. The New Urban Agenda, of course, is about cities, not necessarily about regions. There are a lot of SDGs that sort of could be read as implying that regional planning would be a good way to accomplish, to meet those SDGs. But it's not terribly explicit. So if you are a regional planner and you're interested in applying the SDGs, And you can do that, it's voluntary, and you can, every country is being encouraged, or every city is being encouraged to customize the SDGs to their own needs. So I think what might be needed, and what I'm encouraging the Regional Planning Division of APA is to work with us and potentially other divisions to do a follow-on to what you might have seen, a recent PAS report called Emerging Trends in Regional Planning. It's an excellent report. It's pretty recent, pretty comprehensive. And so I'm recommending that, but it was being developed kind of in parallel with the SDGs, so it's not terribly informed by the SDGs. So what I'm proposing is a Divisions Council research grant, again, small, but it's a start, to overlay the SDGs on this regional planning, their recommendations about methodologies and so forth. And I think that'll be a really useful exercise. And in the process, they should be considering the UN Habitat's urban and territorial planning guidelines, which do an excellent job of showing how the different scales of geography can be integrated in planning. So I'll end it there, and I'm really looking forward. So there's much more presentation on that last research project idea that you can get from the slides. So further to this, at the back of the room, there's a one-page stack of one-page brochures or flyers on the Planning for All Ages project, and a few of our division brochures. You can visit our website, which is right here. And then I've given, again, the blog, Jeff Soul's blog, for more information, as well as my email. So what I've been talking about, and everybody here has been talking about, is just a prelude to what you as planners and your organizations, your agencies, could or should do. And ask any question you want, but I'm hoping we'll get creative and get some feedback from the audience. So, please. So, what questions do you have? Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Has to do with advocating this new urban agenda.
Mm-hmm.
I think until recently, until let's say Trump, there was the feeling that it's a given thing. Nobody can object. I mean, the new urban agenda and the SDGs are written in a way that most people with common sense would say that's fine.
We call it mom and apple pie.
Yeah, that's fine, and that's an advantage, but it's also a disadvantage because nobody feels like we have to fight for it. But I have read some articles, say, from the alt-right movement, if you can call it a movement, the thing around Steve Bannon, and they completely denounced SDGs and the new urban agenda as a kind of communist plot. And I think it's spreading. There is a kind of contra movement to say we don't want this liberal stuff. We want just free markets or individual freedom. All these ideas are actually to lock us in a system that would constrain our liberty. So I'm wondering, in this climate, what is your organization doing to weigh on the public debate to say don't take it for granted, fight for it?
Mm-hmm. So are you talking mainly about the U.S. or other countries as well?
Well, other countries as well, but I think it's most visible now on the international scene that in the States there is a kind of contra movement.
Yeah,
against this.
sure.
Yeah.
Can I flip the question back and ask what, if anything, you're seeing in Europe? I mean, it's quite clear here what that looks like in the United States, but in Europe, is something like congestion pricing for automobiles or smaller, denser housing. I mean, are there? We're well aware in the U.S., at least in what we read in the media, of a rising right wing around immigration in Europe. But how, if at all, is that affecting common sense land use planning and city planning precepts? I would love to ask you that. I mean, are you seeing a pushback against new urban agenda style urbanism in Europe from the alt-right in Europe?
I can't answer for entire Europe.
If anybody has thoughts on that, I'd be very curious to
You
know.
see in several countries a kind of movement towards more nationalism,
Yeah.
which is clearly against this kind of trend of we are all connected, right? And the nationalism tends to say we do the things our own way. We don't want to comply to international standards because they are actually undermining our national sovereignty. Okay? I think this is happening in France. It's happening in the Netherlands. It's happening in Austria.
Right.
In many European countries, you see that political parties are emerging and actually denouncing these kind of international agreements and say, we have our own approach to things when it comes to property or to migration or to mobility. Yes, the cars, my freedom. So I wouldn't say it's like a battle we won already. Everybody will simply implement. And I wonder what is the role of our planning associations.
Okay, well, let me answer real quick, and then we need to get to other questions. But and this will be a partial answer. But APA regularly develops communication tools to combat against sort of ignorance about what planners do and what our value is. So that's in general about planning, and those tools are disseminated throughout the membership. And secondly, we have a policy and advocacy director based in our Washington office who regularly lobbies Congress. I mean, we're an organization that is legally able to lobby Congress. And so we don't focus on changing the president's mindset or the administration's mindset, but we do lobby Congress, and I believe we also lobby to some extent various relevant departments like housing and urban development and so forth about these topics. Now, having said as much, I don't think that yet we have addressed the sustainable development goals on those levels. I know we have collaborated with the international departments of housing and urban development who were involved in the SDGs development process. But I think the main answer to your question is what we're doing is we're focusing on planners and cities and towns and counties and so forth, and not on the national government. And this is where the U.S., I think, is able to hold itself a little higher. It's not necessarily on national policies, but in the end, ultimately, I think we'll do well on sustainable development because the cities, they know that they need to do this. Even ones as conservative as Houston and its lack of zoning for decades and decades now realizes the importance of good planning. So, next question.
Yeah. So my name is Azar Hassan. I am a PhD student at Michigan State University, and my dissertation topic about measuring urban sustainability. So,
Okay.
I'm really a big fan with the presentation, and I believe there is 3 issues in this topic, in sustainable development in general. Issues with definition, and issues with indicators and how we measure it.
Mm-hmm.
So since 1987, we have what we call vague definition of sustainable development. Many agencies, United Nations, UN Habitat, and a lot of agencies, they use the same definition in different ways based on their perspective.
Right.
So I believe personally we need maybe a new definition or maybe different definition of sustainable development based on the scale. Okay, what we have talking about here is about the global scale.
All right.
How about the national scales? How about the regional scales? How
Right.
about the spatial scales? How
Right.
about the local scales?
Yeah.
Each scale has different characteristics,
Right.
and priorities. This is the number 1 issue. Number 2 issue is how we measure urban sustainability or sustainable development in general.
Right.
We have 11 new goals,
Mhm.
how we measure. Okay, we talked about the issues with data availability. Is there any innovative way to measure indicators in different ways based on the scales and definitions?
Right.
So
Yeah, good
things,
questions.
These things, honestly, is part of my dissertation, but just wanted to bring it out here.
Shipra, do you have some thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, yeah, I was smiling when you said that we are still defining sustainable development based on a vague 1987 definition provided by the Brundtland Commission. But I still think that in terms of its concept and it's touching, different contexts, I think that definition still stays very, very valid. Addressing the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future with economic, social, and environmental. We've never really been able to move away from that triangle of economic, social, and environmental because this is really the fundamental in terms of the interaction, But I do agree with you that that definition, or I wouldn't say the definition, the concept of sustainable development needs to be contextualized. I think what Greg was showing us was you use different metrics and you get different results. And it's up to you to really, as a community, as a city, as a place, as a country, to decide which are the most important dimensions of sustainable development for you. And then what are the indicators that you use to measure them? And also what are the capacities you have to collect data against those indicators? Because a lot of the times we have these ideal set of indicators, but there's no viability. There is no baseline, there is no capacity to collect those indicators, and then there is no capacity to do something with that data. That's the other thing. You collect a lot of data and it becomes meaningless if you really don't have the capacity to process it and feed it back into your policy-making system. So I think in that respect, yes, we need a lot of contextualization, which is why we're constantly talking to national agencies and regional bodies and other organizations to say, make this your own. Really make this your own by layering your context over it, pulling out the most important issues, pulling out the most important metrics, and see what you can do with it. So that's really very much our priority, very much our agenda.
Yes.
Hi, this question is for Andrew. My name is Quito Ecuador, and I work with the city of Brooklyn at Ecological design construction here. And so your focus on cultural heritage was really interesting for me, and especially Brooklyn has seen immense growth in the last few years, and we are fast growing into our eastern neighborhoods. And so the struggle is, how do you incorporate our cultural heritage and uniqueness as we grow? And so I was really interested in what you talked about in the Living Heritage Symposium. How do you integrate intangible qualities of place in design review and permitting? So what were the results? What are there any solutions to that?
Andrew, could you repeat the question in summary form?
Does it work? Oh yeah. The question was about how you can incorporate intangible heritage or social heritage into planning for places. And it's an excellent question. I can give you a United States specific answer, although I think this has applicability in a lot of places. And that is that the process that we use right now for inventorying heritage assets and then incorporating that data into planning is 50 years old. We're working on the model of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 and the National Register of Historic Places, which was created as a planning tool. The impetus for creating the National Register was to identify the location of built heritage so that it could be taken account of in highway building and laying out of dams and planning. But what we know from a half a century of practice is a couple things. One, that the standards for listing on the National Register are not a good proxy for what people value about the built environment in their community. And second, that some of the key drivers of quality of life, social cohesion, sense of place are intangible and not tangible. So a 50-year-old system that's still mostly done with paper and pen that only looks at landmarks and doesn't take account of intangibles is not optimized for realizing the potential. So what do? Well, the two key things that came out of that symposium, and which I think people are finding lots of places, is that we need to supplement or inventorying landmarks with a broader process of mapping values. So how do you map the values of your community? What do people love and treasure and value about their community, tangible and intangible? A subset of which will be listed monuments, but the broader list is important data. That values mapping process has to be stakeholder driven. Right now, in many places in the United States, somebody with a master's degree from a school of historic preservation comes into your town and tells you what architectural landmarks you have, and that's your heritage. If the process of deciding what the community's heritage is not inclusive, then the output won't be a driver of participation and inclusion. And so stakeholder-driven processes facilitated by experts where all the members of the community, including new arrivals and marginalized peoples, get to say what they value about the community, using that output as a mapping of social values, and then starting to incorporate that into planning documents in parallel with 106, National Register, and NEPA processes, I think is the way of the future.
We'll take one more question, and then we'll call it quits. Yes, sir.
So for us sitting here who are interested in the work you're doing and what's going on across the world, not just the U.S. but across the world, how do we best get involved? So in my example, I just recently retired, environmental background professional, but I'm interested in how to engage and give value somewhere on the planet and some of the exciting work that you're doing for the benefit of the community.
Well, join the international division and send me an email with your resume.
Yeah, I would make a plan. Join ISOCARP. No, actually.
I'm a member of ISOCARP.
Yes,
too.
please join ISOCARP. But more than that, I think it's important. There are many networks out there that are, of civil society, of professionals. There's the Habitat Professionals Forum that's doing a lot of work on human settlements. There is the General Assembly of Partners that was set up for Habitat 3. Really, you can send us an email, but if you just go on some of these websites and see how these different constituencies are aligning themselves. ISOCARP is a member of several of them, so is APA and its international division. There are a lot of these networks that you should get engaged with, and you could get engaged with, which offer opportunities for both learning and giving. And I think that's something that we very, very highly welcome.
Well, we would be happy to have you be involved in our sort of national and international efforts. My bias would be, given everything we've said here today, to find a way to get involved locally if you're from Portland. And, that might be the most effective in the end. Well, thank you very, very much. Again, check the International Division webpage, and the slides from all four of us will be up within a week or two.